Welcome to our latest video for NC Star on creating a school improvement plan that focuses on implementing a tiered instructional system. Today I'm very fortunate to have Dr. Amy Jablonski here with us, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Yes, I'm thankful to be here. I'm the Director of Integrated Academic and Behavior Systems at the Department of Public Instruction here in North Carolina. And one of the main pushes in our division is to help install a statewide system of a multi-tiered system of support.
And I'm Alessandro Montaneri. I'm in charge of school improvement planning and NC Star for the whole state.
We want to start off with some common language to help assist in aligning NC Star and MTSS. Alessandro and I have been working together for a couple years, and when we sat down to work on this, we really determined that NC Star is a web-based tool to utilize within the entire MTSS framework to guide total school improvement. So these are not competitive. What you'll see is how to use NC Star within the framework to drive total school improvement.
And in NC Star, we know that one of the key indicators, A4.01, focuses on creating that tiered instructional system at the school. So hopefully the schools are using that indicator to start creating those action steps that are necessary to make sure to implement that tiered instructional system, which is one of the components of MTSS.
As we continue, just want to make sure that we debunk a couple of the big myths out there regarding MTSS. The first is here that MTSS is not a process for special education services. This is previous older types of thinking that students have to move from one layer of support to another to get special education services. Throughout our professional development, we really do talk about it's about creating an entire framework of support that meets students where they are, regardless of their need to get the right intervention at the right time. Another myth is that MTSS is just for students who are struggling. In fact, all students are part of an MTSS framework. As we keep pulling that lens back further and further and thinking about MTSS as an entire school improvement model or framework, then all students and all staff are part of MTSS. That is also a different way of thinking to make sure that we don't have some students in MTSS. We're all part of a multi-tiered system of support, just like we don't have some students or staff in school improvement and others not. We're talking about accelerated learning for all students, regardless if they're struggling or even if they happen to be on grade level or happen to be meeting standards that are above that grade level expectation. Now that we've gone through some myths about MTSS, I want to really unpack these facts. One fact here is that MTSS is actually comprised of 6 critical components, and they're here on your screen. These 6 critical components are big ideas about MTSS, and each of them is clearly defined in what's called the self-assessment of MTSS, also known as SAM. These 6 critical components actually make up the entire framework. Even though today we're talking about looking at a tiered instruction or intervention model, just want to be sure that we understand that that in itself cannot exist without these other 5. These other 5 actually are really the molding and the support to install that particular model. We talk about having leadership at the table, making sure that we have a strong leadership team, school improvement team, just overall leadership team to drive school improvement. Making sure that we have teaming structures that help build capacity and infrastructure for implementation of anything we're going to do, our PLCs, our grade level teams. Making sure that we have communication and collaboration, not just inside of our school system, but also outside, and really focusing on two-way communication, making sure that we're asking our stakeholders about school improvement and our vertical alignments particularly. We also focus on data-based problem solving, and I'm going to couple that with data evaluation. Data-based problem solving gets at making sure we have pretty much a problem-solving model that's grounded in research to help us evaluate why we're getting the results that we're getting. And when we do that and we pair it with data evaluation, which pairs implementation and outcome data side by side, then we're able to take a look at really changes that need to adjust within our 3-tiered instruction intervention model. So all this goes together to be able to install that triangle, if you will, within these 6 critical components. Because of the focus of this particular video, I'm going to spend time unpacking the layering of support, or that's 3-tiered instruction intervention model. Just to be clear, this is really spelled out in that self-assessment of MTSS, going through the components that need to be there to make this successful. But here we see the iconic triangle, the layering of support. At the base of it all, we have a differentiated core. And we want to make sure that all of our students are part of core instruction. And also, I do want to point out that this is a pre-K through 12 model. This is not just about elementary or middle or high school. Everybody is part of this particular work in building this framework. Within our differentiated core, we talk about installing practices that ensure that we get the majority of our students successful without needing supplemental or intensive supports. We want to have a system in place that actually provides supplemental supports that supports the implementation of standards within our differentiated core. And then finally, our most intensive layer of instructional support is there, and that's layered on top of supplemental and differentiated. These layers should not be disconnected from each other. A lot of times we have students who move around our building and throughout our districts who receive lots of support for their for addressing any adverse outcomes they may be coming across. But we need to take a step back and asking, what alignment do they get? Just because we give students more help or more support does not mean that we're closing those gaps that we need to. In fact, we want to have a system of support that is really tailored to meet the needs of schools and districts across North Carolina. And this would be unique to each district and possibly each school, depending on the area that you are. The reason why we focus on this model itself is really to get at the root here of, we have relied a long time on supplemental and intensive supports for students who are struggling for a variety of reasons. And we have to come to the conclusion that we can no longer intervene our way out of a faulty core. Meaning that if we have a lot of students who are needing extra supports to be successful within our schools, we have to ask the question, why? Why is that occurring? And when we ask that question about why, we come back to conversations about the environment of our school, the environment of the classroom, the environment in which we build class rosters, and the environment of including our master scheduling, which I'll get to later. We'll talk about our curriculum choices. You know, we have our standards for sure, but what curriculum are we providing to have students grapple with these standards? And then what instructional practices are we providing to help install that curriculum in that environment to help our students be successful? And so within this, I definitely encourage you as you're walking through this particular indicator to not put all the focus or so much focus on supplemental and intensive or overall support system for students. Having that system of support, really asking, what are we providing for all students, and is it strong enough? And if it's not strong enough, then you'll know, because you have a lot of students who are showing up in different various data sets of needing extra support. Core itself and all these other supports are definitely address areas of academics, but they also address areas of behavior, like our school-wide expectations, as well as social emotional progressions over time. We also want to address areas of attendance here. Typically we make really good changes throughout our practices, but if we're not looking at our attendance data, then we may be making really good practice changes, but the students aren't there to receive that impact. We get this question quite a bit within our division of, what does MTSS mean for me? And people want to go see MTSS. They want to know when they're doing MTSS. Our broad scale response is that when you're doing school improvement, you can't really go see MTSS, like you can't go see school improvement. We like to focus people on what are those 6 critical components, that what is it that you're wanting to get more assistance with versus overall. And that's also like with the indicators, right? How do we know we're doing school improvement? We're working through our indicators. We're working through the components within the self-assessment of MTSS. So what we know at a school level, when we talk about installing school improvement in general, but when we talk about installing this particular indicator or this component within SAM, however it is that you're building your school improvement plan, we want to talk about these particular areas. A healthy school culture talks about having an engaging environment, especially at our secondary level, not outplaying those in middle school or elementary. But secondary engagement is the one big focus that we really want to have our students be engaged within the school. But a healthy school culture does address things like cultural responsivity, things of making sure our curriculum choices match the population that we're serving. The way that we're interacting with students, that we're having positive interactions, and really taking a look at, that overall vertical and horizontal alignment. Does it make sense? And do our students want to be here? The master schedule is a tool that helps our teachers deliver instruction. And our master schedule needs to protect core instruction, and throughout the day allows for supplemental instruction for all students. This means moving away from any type of rhetoric that students will get supports for overcoming potential adverse outcomes in schools after or before school. And we want to make sure that students can get all of core plus more without interrupting core instruction. This comes to be doing things like ensuring that our staff has time to deliver core plus more. And that in this next bullet, taking a look at our teachers are instructing in their areas of strength. We want to make sure that our most fragile students receive the most high quality instruction in core and any type of system of support that they might need outside of core instruction. We want to ask questions about, why is it that typically our most fragile students are the ones who move throughout our building, losing instructional time, and those who come in not at risk tend to get the most instructional time because they're not in transition across our school buildings. And then when we take a look at our overall at the school level, that our building makes sense. That our school system makes sense, that it makes sense to vertically and horizontally go throughout our school system, that every building level, each grade level, how we ask students to acquire areas of ELA or mathematics or our sciences and our social studies, all of these areas, areas of behavioral practices, and then our skill sets of taking notes and understanding vocabulary. It actually makes sense throughout our buildings. We find within unpacking really an integrated model with academics and behaviors is that we find that students are having to navigate some processes, procedures, even the way that they take in information or be presented information, having to spend much more time on their cognitive energy with that component versus grappling with the standards. And then we have our support plans that are aligned to accelerate learning opportunities for students who are behind grade level and those who have already mastered grade level content. MTSS is about accelerating learning and making sure we have those opportunities for people along the way. So as a school administrator, these are the areas that we really want to focus on when we talk about this particular indicator, and you will see this reflected in the self-assessment of MTSS as well.
So one of the things we've learned with NC STAR rollout the past 2 years is that many schools are discovering that NC STAR is definitely not your traditional school improvement plan. It doesn't follow the typical template, the typical spreadsheet that we've been used to for years, in the sense that in the past, our school improvement plans were very much focused on those SMART goals that went at the very top of the plan. And the plans were very much compliance driven. We had to create plans every 2 years. We would cut and paste a lot of information just because we needed to create these school improvement plans. In NC STAR, you still have those SMART goals. There's an actual section in set direction that allows you to type in your SMART goals in there. But the real focus in NC STAR is really on not only a continuous improvement process for the first time, where you continuously add and edit and modify your plan through the years, but it's also this focus on everything Amy's been stressing, this focus on practice and on adult behavior. Because the idea behind it is if we get the adults in the building to do what they're supposed to do, then we will get our SMART goals to become reality. And then finally, this idea from the project management world of thinking small, where if we are able to actually spell out every little thing that needs to happen for us to achieve an objective, then our chances of achieving that objective go sky high. Because you as an administrator, you as a school improvement team are actually able to spell out every little thing we need to do to get to that point. So that's been the big difference with the NC STAR tool, as it's used throughout the state now in North Carolina. And then both in MTSS and in NC STAR trainings or conversations that we have with schools and districts, we obviously focus on the importance of making data-driven decisions.
And so one of the critical components that I had mentioned early on is data evaluation. And you see an example here where we're looking at implementation data, such as the implementation using the self-assessment of MTSS or SAM, NC STAR reports, or possibly other implementation data that you have. These things could be time studies, walkthroughs, taking a look at different types of surveys, even though that could be an outcome data, that can be an implementation to help us understand what our barriers are for how it is that we're doing work. And then we have our overall outcome data we can look at. We can look at things of our academic successes over time. And this is not just larger scale sets of data, such as end of grade or EOC data. This is more like common formative assessment data, taking a look at those smaller increments over time, as Alessandro had mentioned. Our behavior data, our office discipline referral data. If we're not spending time capturing office discipline referral data, then we're missing out on problem solving, because we could be going ahead and installing great academic changes, but our students may not be present to be able to experience those. And same with attendance, making sure that we're capturing where our students are and being chronically absent. We know across the nation in North Carolina, our K-1 students are the highest level of truancy. And so, like, what is it that we need to do that then we could build into implementation to change that attendance? Then you see other components like our dropout and graduation and our staff turnover. Really also how our staff is just overall performing with our students. And different ways that we could break this down depend on your school demographics. We have some examples here of what we could take a look at to see that, to make sure that we're not creating a system that actually perpetuates disproportionality, but goes ahead and addresses that by looking at our demographic data.
Yeah, I think as Amy pointed out, when we talk about a continuous improvement process, we're all familiar with PDSA, Plan, Do, Study Act, or Plan, Do, Check Act. And we need to make sure that at a school level, and we would also say at a district level, you need to have those systems and structures in place that allow you to constantly monitor all these pieces of information that are all part of this big jigsaw puzzle called school improvement.
So we get questions across the state about having a lot of teams. Within each of these lenses, we're really not about creating more teams. This work of school improvement, whatever it is that you call it, also comes to you want to actually dismantle a lot of our teams. Because we find a lot of our teams are doing similar work, the same work, or even competing work that's being a barrier for school improvement. So within the professional development for installing a multi-tiered system of support, we take a look at our school teams and we watch school leadership there. School leadership, that's very broad, I get that, but every building level, as you know, has its own context and nuances. One thing within MTSS is that we want to have the right people who have the skill set to give us insight into problem solving. So a lot of skills that we want to look at: who's good at reading data and understanding it and to explain it, who understands the different practices that are being done that are content specialists, and even who understands, has a good pulse on the community in which we serve.
Yeah, and in NC STAR, we understand that we're following what the general statute says about school improvement planning in North Carolina, and we understand about having the elected members following the process, the protocol of creating your school improvement team at the school. But Amy and I have worked together to try to figure out how all of this really is very well connected and joins together. And we're showing you this on this slide.
So within MTSS, our professional development talks about making sure that we're meeting on a regular basis, recommendations one time per month. Again, this can ebb and flow based upon your implementation. But looking at your implementation and outcome data side by side to make large-scale decision-making based on what it is that you're installing. We want to make sure during those meetings that we're installing and building implementation plans. We're taking a look at allocation of resources that address staff and student needs. Talking about how it is that our implementation is going to get the outcomes that we're looking at. And that's a lot of the conversation within our MTSS teams that we ask to happen to help build towards school improvement.
Yeah, and in NC STAR, when you start using the instrument, I mean, you start seeing that the tool actually talks about recording 2 meetings every month. And we, from the very beginning of the rollout of NC STAR, we have said, okay, meeting number 1 has to be your school improvement team because that's required by law, by the general statute. But meeting number 2 every month, we've basically have said that's principal decision. I mean, every principal decides how they do that second meeting, who attends that second meeting, and that's where Amy and I see a possibility of that could definitely be an MTSS team meeting. Now, one very important thing that we are constantly preaching as we travel the state is that if you have your elected members of your school improvement team when meeting number 1, and then you have an MTSS team meeting number 2, you should not have completely different individuals in both of these meetings. There has to be some members of that MTSS team that are also sitting in that school improvement team, because if not, you have a problem of communication. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So as we've been reading plans for the past 2 years now in the system, one of the difficulties that schools are having is on creating those action steps. So our latest trainings have focused on helping schools realize that when you're creating action steps, you really are talking about 4 or 5 different things that you have to be worried about. You got to be worried about developing something, about the communication aspects of that, about how you're going to support that implementation, how you're going to monitor the impact of what you're trying to do in the school, and then the last one, which is not here, it has to do with how we're going to sustain these practices in our building. So what Amy and I have done is put together a couple of slides here for you to try to explain how this deals with creating that tiered instructional system in A4.01. So the first thing, as we said, was developing. So we got to create something to achieve that goal of ours, whether this be a document, a survey, a form. There are definitely many action steps that you can put here in NC STAR, but these are some that Amy thought of.
Taking a look at the self-assessment of MTSS, one of the first steps within having a tiered instruction intervention model in place is making sure that we have developed a core academic, behavioral, social, emotional practices. And we have some resources in our MTSS Live Binder in our professional development. From there, we take what it is that our data says we need to change. We define what it is that we're going to be doing for all staff and all students. And then we create our professional development supports that align with coaching supports and implementation tools. So that way we know what it looks like, sounds like, feels like when we walk in our classrooms of here are the overall curriculum and instructional practices that as a school we've decided to do because these are the gaps that we have. And so here we would make that development, and this again includes pre-K through 12.
So after we've created those action steps that deal with these 4 bullets that we're talking about here, then we have to worry about communication at our school. So how we're going to communicate all this information. So for example, in the case of we created a professional development, we then obviously have to deliver the PD to our whole staff and clearly define those instructional strategies that we want for that core. And then we got to figure out how we're going to be sharing the plan for implementation, for monitoring, and for sustainability of what we're doing. In step 3 of possible action steps, we talk about supporting implementation. What are you going to do to support this, to make sure this is really happening, that practices are changing?
And so we talk about making sure we're going to utilize that established coaching plan. We know that professional development does not change practices, coaching changes practices. And that's how we can best support implementation. And so here's that example of using those established practices that we've determined to help support implementation.
Yeah, and what a lot of schools end up doing is even creating a special walkthrough form or walkthrough app to make sure that those practices are being done with fidelity in the classrooms.
We'll take a look at monitoring impact. Here we want to take a look at having our implementation data, whatever the determination is to collect that based on what it is you're installing, what makes sense, and utilizing that with our student outcome data so we can see how we're monitoring impact. Again, we're only getting the results we're getting because of what we implemented. And then we can use that piece of data, those pieces of data, after it's at the school level to come down to grade level or PLC teams or department teams to problem solve the strategies for successful implementation to make sure that we're getting some changes with our impact. Some of the messaging within this is getting at Deming's quote here that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets, meaning that we can change our practices, we can change our data sets, we can install what maybe looks like on the surface level some type of tiered instructional intervention model, but really hopefully what you've seen here, it's about installing all 6 of those critical components so that way we can have that take place. The work of school improvement will never end. We're always going to look for rooms of improvement over time. The idea of implementation never ends. And these tools are here to help guide you in that so that way you can have success for both your staff and your students.
We are here to help. If you have any questions regarding MTSS at your school or at district level, feel free to contact Dr. Jablonski. There's the email. And if you have any questions regarding school improvement planning around the state, just feel free to contact me by email as well. There's my email. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we hope that you have found this to be helpful.